The station was called the Grand Conclave. It floated in the middle of deep space, far from any single star. Built by many hands over many centuries, it was the most important place in the known galaxy. Every major species had a seat there. Every voice that mattered had spoken in its great hall. And now, for the first time in 300 years, a new species had been invited to join. Humanity had arrived. The human delegation came on a ship called the Endurance. It was not the biggest ship in the docking bay. It was not the most decorated. It had a few dents on the hull from old asteroid scrapes, and the paint near the engines had faded to a dull gray. But it landed cleanly, and its crew walked out with their heads up. Ambassador Sarah Okafor led the group. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and calm brown eyes. She wore a dark blue jacket with small gold pins that represented every nation on Earth that had voted to send her here. She had spent 40 years in diplomacy. She had talked her way through wars, famines, and 3 separate government collapses. She did not look nervous. She was, in fact, very nervous. But she had learned long ago that there was a difference between feeling fear and showing it. The welcoming committee was made up of 3 alien representatives. There was Counselor Sivan of the Veil 3, a thin, pale species with large dark eyes and slow, graceful movements. There was Elder Doss of the Kausari, an ancient species with thick gray skin and voices that sounded like rocks grinding together. And there was Trade Director Velk of the Syndex, a 4-armed merchant species who smelled faintly of something sweet and always seemed to be calculating something. They greeted the humans politely. They spoke slowly and clearly, as if they were not sure whether the humans would understand. Counselor Sivan offered a soft bow. Elder Doss nodded once. Trade Director Velk extended 2 of his 4 hands, and then looked slightly embarrassed when Okafor shook both of them at the same time, without hesitation. The humans were given a tour of the station. The main hall alone was large enough to hold an entire city block. The ceilings were so high that a human could not see where they ended. The walls were covered in panels showing the histories of the member species, their wars, their discoveries, their golden ages. Humanity's section was blank. There was a small plaque that read, "New Member, History Pending." One of the junior diplomats in the human group, a young man named Tobias Wren, stopped in front of that blank panel for a long moment. He did not say anything. He just looked at it. They were shown to their quarters, which were clean and comfortable, but located in the East Wing, the part of the station farthest from the main council chambers. The rooms were fine. The distance was not an accident. Okafor noticed it immediately and said nothing. The first formal session of the council happened the next morning. The hall was round and very large, with seats rising up in curved rows like an ancient theater. Each species had its own section, decorated with the colors of their world. The humans sat in the outer ring, at the edge, in chairs that were slightly lower than those around them. Again, this was not an accident. Elder Doss of the Kausari spoke first, as was tradition. He gave a long speech about the history of the council and the importance of cooperation. He did not mention Earth or humanity once. Then he sat down and several other representatives spoke in turn. When the time finally came for the human delegation to address the room, there was a small but noticeable murmur. A few heads turned. Some did not. Okafor stood up. She spoke clearly and simply. She said that humanity was grateful to be here. She said that Earth had watched the stars for a long time and had dreamed of this moment. She said that humans came not to take, but to contribute. She said they understood they were new, and that they had a great deal to learn. She sat back down. The response was polite. There was a soft, measured sound, the equivalent of applause in the council's formal language. But there were no warm words from the other representatives. No one stood to welcome them. No one offered to share resources or open trade routes or propose a partnership. They were simply noted, registered, filed away. After the session, Okafor walked through the long corridor that connected the council hall to the residential wing. Counselor Sivan of the Velthri fell in to step beside her. The two walked in silence for a moment. "You spoke well," Sivan said. Her voice was soft and slightly musical, like wind through glass. "Thank you," Okafor said. "They do not mean to be cold," Sivan said. "It is simply that most new species do not last very long. It becomes difficult to invest too much attention in a newcomer before they have proven themselves." "How long does that usually take?" Okafor asked. Sivan was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes 100 years. Sometimes 200. Sometimes they simply fade." Okafor nodded slowly. "We have been fading for a long time," she said. "We are still here." Sivan looked at her. Something about the way the human had said that made her pause. It was not a boast. It was not even a challenge. It was said the same way a person might say the sun rose this morning. Simply, as a fact. She watched Okafor walk ahead down the corridor, back straight, step steady, like someone who had a long road to walk and had already decided they would reach the end of it. Later that night, in her private chamber, Sivan sat by the observation window and looked out at the stars. She had spent 200 years studying species. She had watched civilizations rise and fall. She had seen great powers collapse under their own pride, and small peoples survive things that should have destroyed them. She could not explain why, but there was something about the human delegation that she could not stop thinking about. Something she had seen in their eyes when they sat in those low chairs at the edge of the room. They had not looked humiliated, they had looked patient. As if they had been here before, at the edge of something, looked down on, expected to fail, and had found that it did not bother them the way it bothered everyone else. She could not name the feeling it gave her. It was not quite worry. It was something smaller than that. Something distant, like the first sound of thunder before a storm you cannot yet see. The message came in at 0400 station time, when most of the Grand Conclave was quiet. It came through the emergency channel, the one that was supposed to be reserved for disasters, not diplomatic incidents. A Syndex colony called Marin 4, located on the outer rim near the edge of mapped space, was under attack. The Drakthar had hit it. The Drakthar Imperium was not a member of the Galactic Council. They had never applied. They operated in the outer rim like a wound that never quite healed, raiding, taking, retreating before anyone could respond with enough force to stop them. They were not the most powerful species in the galaxy. They were simply the most willing to cause pain for small gain. Over the past 40 years, they had raided 7 Syndex colonies, 2 Kosari trade routes, and 1 Veil 3 research station. Each time, the Council had convened. Each time, committees had been formed. Each time, the Drakthar had finished what they were doing and gone home before the first vote was cast. It was a pattern. Everyone knew it was a pattern, and the pattern continued because there was never anyone close enough to stop them in time. Until now. Captain Danny Rourke was 39 years old and had commanded the IFS Temerity for 6 years. The Temerity was a human frigate, medium-sized, fast, built for long-range survey work, and capable of holding its own in a fight. It had been running a geological mapping survey 3 sectors over from Marin 4 when the emergency channel lit up. Rourke was in the mess hall drinking coffee when her communications officer patched the signal through. She listened to the full report without moving. Marin 4, population 80,000. Drakthar fleet 9 warships. Estimated time until the colony was destroyed 4 to 6 hours. Nearest Council military response 18 hours away, pending authorization. She set down her coffee cup. "Get me a direct line to the Council chamber," she said. Back on the Grand Conclave, the emergency session had already started. Trade Director Velk was speaking loudly about the need for an immediate response. Elder Doss was calling for a formal assessment of the threat level before any action was taken. 3 other representatives were arguing about which committee had the authority to authorize military movement in that sector. Councillor Sivan sat with her hands folded and watched the room carefully, the way she always did, looking for the thing that no one else was saying. The human channel opened. Rourke's voice came through clearly. "This is Captain Danny Rourke of the IFS Temerity. I am currently 41 minutes from Marin 4. I am requesting confirmation that the colony is under active Drakthar attack, and that council support is not available within response time. Elder Doss looked up. Trade Director Velk stopped talking. The room went slightly quiet. The operations officer confirmed the information. Yes, the colony was under attack. Yes, council forces were 18 hours out. Yes, the Temerity was at this moment the closest armed vessel in the sector. Understood, Rourke said. I am moving to intercept. A long pause filled the council chamber. Captain, Elder Doss said slowly, his voice careful. The Drakthar have 9 warships at Marin 4. You have 1 frigate. This is not, we do not advise. Noted, Rourke said. Temerity out. The channel closed. The council chamber was very quiet for a moment, then everyone started talking at once. Councillor Sci-Fi did not talk. She pulled up the technical file on the IFS Temerity. She read it carefully. Then she read the file on human combat doctrine. Then she sat very still for a while. 9-1. The Drakthar outnumbered the Temerity 9-1, and she was moving to intercept. On board the Temerity, Rourke walked onto the bridge and took her seat. Her crew was already at their stations. No one was panicking. The navigator, Ensign Priya Shah, was already plotting the fastest route to Marin 4. The weapons officer, Sergeant Leo Harkin, was running system checks without being asked. What's our status? Rourke said. Weapons ready. Shields at full. We'll be in range in 38 minutes, Harkin said. Good. Rourke opened a channel to the Drakthar fleet. She did not ask for permission from the council to do this. There was no time for permission. There was only the math of the situation. 80,000 people, 1 ship, 38 minutes. Drakthar fleet, she said. This is Captain Danny Rourke of the IFS Temerity, representing the interplanetary forces of Earth. You are engaged in an attack on a civilian colony under Galactic Council jurisdiction. You have 12 minutes to withdraw. I will not repeat this message. She closed the channel. Harkin looked at her. They won't withdraw. Probably not, she agreed. We're going in anyway. Yes. He turned back to his console and kept working. That was the thing about her crew, Rourke thought. They did not need long explanations. They did not need to be convinced. They already knew the calculation. And they had each, in their own private way, already decided. 12 minutes passed. The Drakthar did not withdraw. The Temerity came out of its approach burn and entered the combat zone at full speed, guns already firing. The first Drakthar warship was hit before it could reposition. The second took damage along its port side and pulled back. Rourke flew the Temerity like she was angry at it, cutting hard between 2 of the larger ships, using their own mass against each other, forcing them to hold fire to avoid hitting their own fleet. It was not a clean fight. The Temerity took hits. Alarms went off. 1 section lost pressure and had to be sealed. 2 crew members were injured. But the ship kept moving, kept fighting, kept forcing the Drakthar to deal with it instead of with the colony below. The battle lasted 47 minutes. When the dust cleared, 3 Drakthar warships had been destroyed. 2 more were badly damaged, and the remaining 4 had pulled back to a safe distance. The colony of Marin 4 was still standing. All 80,000 of its people were alive. On the Grand Conclave, the Council had been watching the battle through a live feed from a nearby sensor buoy. The room was silent for a long time after the Drakthar withdrew. Councillor Sivan looked at the feed showing the damaged but intact Temerity floating in front of the colony it had defended alone. She thought again about what Okafor had said to her in the corridor. We have been fading for a long time. We are still here. 6 weeks after the battle at Marin 4, Councillor Sivan of the Veil 3 locked herself in a research room on the Grand Conclave, and did not come out for 3 days. She was reading files. It had started simply enough. After the Temerity's battle with the Drakthar, the Council's intelligence branch had quietly begun collecting information on human behavior during crisis situations. It was standard procedure for any new member species. You wanted to know who you were dealing with. You wanted to understand what they were capable of, what made them stop, what made them retreat. The problem was, the files kept growing. There was the Temerity incident, of course, 1 ship against 9. But then there were others. An Earth transport that had been hit by a surprise meteor impact in a dangerous sector. The crew had sealed the damage, rationed their food, and kept the ship running for 62 days on backup systems before rescue arrived. A human explorer named Marcus Fenn, who had been stranded on an ice planet with a broken navigation system, and had walked 40 kilometers to a rescue beacon in a storm that should have killed him in an hour. A military unit on Earth's moon that had continued to hold its position for 11 hours after losing communications, power, and half its personnel, because no one had given them the order to fall back. 11 hours, with no power, in a vacuum. Sivan read file after file. She took notes in her careful, precise handwriting. She built a timeline of the past year alone, events that had involved humans and high stress, and the question of whether they would stop or continue. The pattern was the same every time. They continued. She brought in a biologist colleague, Dr. Reth of the Kosari, who specialized in species physiology. She showed him the files and asked him one question. Was there a physical explanation? Dr. Reth spent 2 days reviewing the data. When he came back, he looked uncomfortable in a way that Sivan had never seen on a Kosari face before. There is a chemical, he said. He used the human word for it. Adrenaline. It is produced by their bodies during moments of fear or extreme stress. Most species have something similar. A short burst of heightened ability, faster reaction, more strength, sharper senses, that helps them survive a single dangerous moment. But, Sivan said, in humans, the burst does not behave the same way. He pulled up a diagram. In most species, including ours, the chemical peaks quickly, and then exhaustion sets in. The body forces a rest state. It is a natural ceiling. He paused. Humans appear to have no ceiling. Their bodies can sustain this state for hours. In documented cases, days. The exhaustion comes eventually, but it does not come when it should. It comes after. Sometimes long after. Sivan looked at the diagram for a long time. So when they are afraid, she said slowly, they become more capable, and they stay that way. Not just capable, Dr. Reth said. In some documented cases, a human who loses something, a crew member, a family, a home, becomes more focused than before, more determined. The emotional pain appears to function as fuel in a way we have no parallel for. Sivan closed the diagram. She opened the next file. A Syndex merchant, named Valori, had traded with humans for 6 years on the Outer Rim. She had submitted a voluntary testimony after the Marin 4 incident, because she said she thought someone should know what she had seen. She described a human cargo hauler who had been robbed at a remote station, beaten, left with nothing, his ship stripped. She had expected him to file a complaint and wait for assistance. Instead, he had borrowed tools from the station workshop, repaired his ship using parts from a junked vessel, and tracked the thieves across 2 sectors over 18 months until he recovered every piece of his cargo. He did not do it for money, Valori wrote. By the time he recovered it, he had spent more than the cargo was worth. He did it because they had taken something that was his. He told me that was enough reason. Ohasi of the Veil 3, who had treated a human soldier named Torres after a battle. Torres had broken 3 fingers during the fight. The medic had discovered this during the post-battle examination. Torres had not reported the injury or sought treatment during the fight itself. When Dr. Ohasi asked him why, Torres had shrugged and said the fingers still worked well enough. Well enough, the medic had written. He had continued to operate at full combat effectiveness with 3 broken fingers because in his assessment, the damage was not severe enough to stop him. Sci-Fi finished reading and sat back. The research room was very quiet. She thought about the questions that this raised. Not tactical questions, not political ones, deeper ones, the kind that kept her awake. What does it mean to share a council with a species that does not slow down when it is hurt? What does it mean that the thing which would stop any other species, pain, loss, fear, impossible odds, appears to make them accelerate? She called a closed session, not a full council meeting, just the senior representatives of the 4 oldest member species, in a small room with no observers and no formal record. She stood at the front and presented her findings without emotion, the way she had been trained. Charts, data, documented cases, the biology, the timeline. Halfway through, Elder Das of the Kosari raised one heavy gray hand and asked her to stop. The room was very still. "Counselor," Elder Das said, in a voice that was much quieter than usual, "what exactly is the upper limit of this behavior?" Sci-Fi looked at him. She had thought about how to answer this question. She had spent a day thinking about it, because she wanted to give an accurate answer rather than a reassuring one. "We have not found one," she said. No one spoke for a long time after that. Later, walking back through the long corridors of the station, Sci-Fi passed the great wall of history panels. Still blank. Still waiting. She stood there for a moment and thought about what history usually looked like. Long stretches of peace, occasional wars, the rise of something great, and then the slow fading. Every species eventually found its limit. She looked at the blank panel and thought, what if they don't? The question followed her back to her quarters and sat with her through the night, quiet and patient. Like a human, she realized. Quiet and patient, and not going anywhere. The Drakthar struck Kepler Station on a Tuesday morning, Earth time. Kepler Station was not a military base. It was a colony world, a place where people had built homes and schools and farms over the course of 2 generations. The population was 2.3 million. They had a small defense force and an older model planetary shield that had never been tested against a full fleet assault. The Drakthar knew all of this. They had chosen Kepler Station precisely because of it. It was meant to be a message, not just to humanity, but to the entire Galactic Council. The Drakthar had been watching carefully since the Marin 4 incident. They had noted how a single human frigate had driven them back. They had decided that the answer to this was not caution. It was escalation. Strike something bigger. Strike something that hurt. Make it clear that the price of standing in their way was too high. This was a catastrophic mistake. The Drakthar fleet consisted of 22 warships. They came out of deep space in a tight formation and began their bombardment at 0600 hours. The old planetary shields held for 11 minutes before the first ones failed. By the end of the first hour, 14,000 people were dead. On the Grand Conclave, the emergency channel erupted. Representatives flooded the council chamber in various states of panic and preparation. Trade Director Velk demanded action. Elder Das called for a full military response authorization from all member species. Forms were pulled up. Votes were called. The machinery of collective decision-making began turning, slowly, the way it always did. Ambassador Okafor was not in the chamber. She was in the human communications room, on a direct encrypted line to Earth's unified command. Her voice was very calm. She spoke for 4 minutes, she listened for 2, then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked back out into the corridor. She did not go to the council chamber. She went to the observation deck and stood at the window and looked at the stars. Behind her, the station hummed with noise and urgency. She stood quietly and waited. 41 minutes after the Drakthar began their attack on Kepler Station, the human response began. It did not begin in one place. It began in 6 places at the same time. The Unified Command had been running contingency plans for Outer Rim aggression since humanity joined the Council. Not because they expected trouble, but because humans planned for trouble as naturally as other species planned for dinner. The plans had names and numbers. They had been updated monthly. When the order came through, the people receiving it did not need to be briefed or organized. They simply began. 3 fleets moved on the Drakthar's known home territories in the Outer Rim, hitting their supply lines, their fuel depots, and their communication relays simultaneously. A 4th fleet moved to reinforce Kepler Station directly. A 5th moved to cut off the Drakthar's retreat route. The 6th, the smallest but the fastest, went directly for the Drakthar High Command's command ship. The Drakthar High Command received the attack reports from all 6 fronts within minutes of each other. For the first time in 40 years of raiding and retreating, they had no idea what to do. They had planned for retaliation. They had not planned for this. A Veil 3 peacekeeping vessel had been positioned near the Kepler system as an observer when the attack began. Its captain, a quiet and experienced officer named Counselor Commander Iath, watched the battle unfold through her sensor arrays. She had seen many battles. She had a good sense for how they moved, how they breathed, when one side was winning and when one side was simply prolonging its loss. She watched the human response for 20 minutes. Then, she opened a channel to the Grand Conclave and transmitted a single line. I strongly advise the Council to not intervene on either side at this time. Back on the station, that message was read aloud in the Council chamber. Several representatives did not understand it. Why would they intervene on the Drakthar's side? That made no sense. They were the ones defending themselves. Elder Doss understood it. He had read Sivon's report. He had thought about it a great deal in the weeks since. He read the message again, and then folded his large gray hands on the table, and said nothing for the rest of the session. By hour 36, the Drakthar were in full retreat. 2 of their home territory bases had been completely destroyed. Their fuel network was gone. Their communication systems were dark. Their fleet had been cut in half. At hour 60, the Drakthar High Command sent a transmission to the Galactic Council, requesting a mediation channel to the human delegation. Ambassador Okafor was given the message. She read it. She sat with it for a moment. Then she dictated her response through the Council's official channel. 4 words, clear and plain. We are not finished. The response was transmitted. The Council went very quiet when they heard it. Even Trade Director Velk, who was rarely quiet, did not speak. Sivon sat at her station and looked at those 4 words on her screen for a long time. She thought about the blank history panel on the wall of the Council's memorial corridor. She thought about the human delegation arriving on their dented ship, sitting in the low chairs at the edge of the room, looking patient. She thought about 14,000 people. She thought, the Drakthar struck a species that has been nearly destroyed before. A species that survived ice ages and plagues and wars with itself that should have ended it a dozen times. A species that learned, somewhere deep in its bones, that the only way to make sure something like that never happened again was to make absolutely certain that the cost of trying was something no one would ever want to pay. They had not sent a message. They had not warned the galaxy that humans were dangerous. They had simply existed, long enough, hard enough, that the lesson was built into them. And now the Drakthar had tried to teach them fear, and were discovering, too late, that this was not a lesson humanity needed. The signing ceremony for the Kepler Accord took place in a small room off the main council chamber. It was not a large event. There were no decorations, no speeches, no formal audience. The Drakthar High Representative, a tall creature named Vorketh, arrived with 2 aides. He wore the formal colors of his rank, but his hands were shaking slightly, and he did not look anyone directly in the eyes. Ambassador Okafor arrived alone. She sat down across from Vorketh at the plain table, and placed the document between them. It was a full and unconditional surrender. Reparations to Kepler Station, withdrawal from all contested Rim territories, dismantling of the outer bases, a 40-year trade and movement restriction on Drakthar fleets. It was, by every measure, the most complete capitulation any species had signed in over 1,000 years of recorded galactic history. Vorkath read it slowly. He did not ask to change anything. He had asked 3 days earlier, and the answer had been the same 4 words, and he had not asked again. He signed it. Okafor signed it. Her expression did not change. She tapped her pen, stood up, and left. She walked back into the main council chamber alone. The full council was in session. When she entered, the room was already in conversation. Other business, other issues, the normal workings of a body that governed hundreds of star systems and never ran out of problems. A few representatives glanced at her. A few did not. She walked to her seat. Her nameplate was no longer at the edge of the table. Someone, she would later find out it was Counselor Sci-Fi, had moved it during the night. It now sat in the third ring, close to the center. A permanent seat, a serious seat, the kind of place where decisions were actually made. She sat down without saying anything. 3 days later, Elder Das of the Kosari formally introduced a motion to elevate humanity to a permanent seat on the Inner Council. The vote took less than 3 minutes. It passed without a single dissenting voice. That had not happened in the Council's 4,000-year history. Not once. Afterward, during the recess, Counselor Sci-Fi found Okafor standing near the large observation window at the end of the main corridor. The window looked out over a wide stretch of open space. Stars everywhere, cold and distant and beautiful. Sci-Fi came to stand beside her. They were quiet for a moment, the way they sometimes were now, comfortably. "How is Kepler Station?" Sci-Fi asked. "Rebuilding," Okafor said. "It will take years, but they are already rebuilding." Sci-Fi nodded. She looked out at the stars. She had been trying to find the right way to ask something for several days, and she had decided that she would simply ask it directly. "Were you afraid?" she said. "During all of it? From the beginning? Were you afraid?" Okafor was quiet for a moment, not because she was deciding whether to answer, but because she was thinking about how to say it correctly. "Every single second," she said, "from the moment I sat in that low chair on the first day, every time another ship went out, every message that came in, every name on the casualty list." She paused. "I was afraid the whole time." Sci-Fi looked at her. "Then how? That's rather the point, isn't it?" Okafor said quietly. She turned to look at Sci-Fi, and there was something in her eyes that was very hard to describe. Not pride, not hardness, but a kind of deep and settled knowledge. "We have always been afraid. From the very beginning. Before we had ships, before we had fire, before we had words for what was out in the dark. We have always been the small ones, the ones without the best armor, or the sharpest claws. Fear is not new to us. We have been living inside it for 100,000 years." She turned back to the window. "We just decided somewhere along the way that it did not get to make the decisions." Sci-Fi stood beside her and looked at the stars, and thought about that for a long time. She thought about all the species she had known, the great ones and the fallen ones, the ones who had dominated for ages and then grown slow and careful, and eventually stopped doing anything risky at all. She thought about the ones that had burned bright for a century and then collapsed. She thought about every civilization that had, at some point, decided that survival meant protecting what it had, rather than reaching for what it did not. And she thought about a species that had climbed out of the mud of one small world, terrified the whole time, all the way up to the stars. Not because they stopped being afraid, because they never let it stop them. 2 weeks later, a junior analyst named Pell, in the Council's Intelligence Archive Division, was updating the official threat assessment database. It was routine work, quarterly reviews of every member and non-member species in the known galaxy. He updated the Drakthar file, reduced threat level, restricted movement, under observation. Then he opened the human file. He sat with it for a while. He read through the categories. He looked at the old classification. It read, Emerging, Class 3, Limited Threat Potential. He thought about the temerity. He thought about 6 simultaneous fronts. He thought about, we are not finished. He scrolled through the threat assessment columns. He looked for the right category. He went through all of them. None of them fit quite right. There was a column for aggressive species, a column for unpredictable species, a column for historically warlike species. None of them were wrong exactly, but none of them captured the thing that he was actually trying to say. There was one column at the far right of the database. It was old. Older than him. Older than most of the people currently working in the archive. In 4,000 years of council history, it had never been used. He had seen it before during training, and been told it was a legacy field, a relic, something from an earlier and more dramatic time. The column heading read, Species that Change the Calculation. Pell looked at it for a long time. Then he moved the human file into it. He closed the database, turned off his console, and went home. Outside the archive windows, the stars were the same as they had always been. Ancient, enormous, indifferent. But the galaxy, in one small and very significant way, was not quite the same as it had been before. It had learned something new about fear, about what it looked like when something felt it completely, carried it every day, and kept moving anyway.